I'll start by saying thank you for everyone who's joining us today for the second afternoon of the Archives Roadshow series. I'd also like to thank the Azrieli Foundation who made this event possible for you today. My name is Ellen Belshaw. I'm the Education Outreach Librarian at the Jewish Public Library and Archive in Montreal. Myself and my colleague Giselle Carter, the Digital Outreach Librarian, will be facilitating the session for you today. After my brief introduction, I will be turning over the floor to our four amazing presenters who will each present for 15 minutes. At the end of all four presentations, we will have a question period, which we will not be recording. So like the first part of the series, this is a Zoom webinar, which is just a little bit different than a meeting in that all audience members are muted and cameras are turned off upon entry. If you have any questions for presenters in either English or French, there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. If you have technical questions or issues, you can indicate those in the Q&A, or you can send an email to events@jplmontreal.org. You're welcome to add questions in the Q&A section at any time during today's session, but we will be posing them all at the end during the Q&A portion of the panel. Because of this, if your question is directed at one specific presenter, please indicate as such. If not, if we can't tell who it's to, it'll be an open question posed to everyone. And thanks to the feedback from part one, sorry about that. So I'll explain a little bit more about the question period at the end. We've also created the Archives Roadshow 2022 hashtag for this event series that we encourage everyone to use if they are sharing their experiences on social media. And please stick around till the end for more information about the last part in the series on December 11th. Before we dive into the presentations, I would like to share the Jewish Public Library's land acknowledgement. The Jewish Public Library is situated on the traditional territory of the Gunganhaga people. The land is also a meeting place for many Indigenous nations. This land has been the site of exchange, creativity, and storytelling for thousands of years. We are grateful to be able to cultivate lifelong learning, imagination, dialogue, and creativity here. The order of presentations will be carried out in the same order that they were listed in promotional material for this event. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, Donna. Donna Bernardo-Ceriz is the Managing Director of the Ontario Jewish Archives Blankenstein Family Heritage Centre in Toronto. She has a Bachelor's of Art degree in History from York University, Toronto, and a Master's of Information from the University of Toronto with a specialization in Archives and Records Management. Passing it over to you, Donna.
Hello, thanks so much, Ellen. I would like to start by acknowledging that the collections of the Ontario Jewish Archives document the Jewish experience on land that has been continuously inhabited and stewarded by many Indigenous peoples. Our offices specifically are situated on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat peoples. We all have ancestors who came to Turtle Island as immigrants, or we are immigrants ourselves. That we were able to do so is not unconnected to the dispossession of Canada's Indigenous peoples and the destruction of their culture, a continuous act that as custodians and stewards of Jewish culture compels us towards action and allyship. Next slide, please. The Ontario Jewish Archives is celebrating our 50th anniversary in 2023. Our mandate since forming has been to acquire, preserve, and provide access to the documentary heritage that chronicles the Ontario Jewish experience. The core of our work is acquiring and caring for this archival evidence, but also creating avenues for the public to understand and engage with these resources in a variety of ways. We do this through research assistance, both in person and remotely, by working with students to improve their archival literacy, through curatorial work like exhibitions, through programming like podcasts, webinars, and our award-winning walking tours, and through community partnerships that extend our reach and ensure that the broader Canadian narratives are inclusive of the Jewish experience. And so I'm very excited to address you today and highlight a small piece of our vast collection on Jewish life. I'll start by saying that choosing one item from a collection of millions is no small feat. By choosing one, I acknowledge that I'm omitting millions of others, each with their own story to tell. Next slide. With that in mind, the item that is going to launch my discussion today is this elevation drawing of Beth Jacob Synagogue. This drawing was created by Benjamin Brown, considered Toronto's first Jewish architect. This one drawing is going to help us discover Brown's body of work, his importance to Toronto's architectural legacy, and the value of his papers to understanding the complex intersections that existed within the Jewish community during the early 20th century. So who was Benjamin Brown and how did we come to possess his collection? In the mid-1980s, the OJA was approached by the Levine family. Jim Levine was an architect and his wife Rochelle was studying architectural history at University of Toronto. While doing a project on Brown, she discovered there was nothing written about him or his work. She found that he was still alive, and so she reached out to set up an interview. They became friends, and during this friendship, Jim and Rochelle had Brown reinstated into the Ontario Association of Architects. In gratitude, Brown bequeathed his entire collection to the Levine family, who in 1987 generously donated it to the OJA, clearly demonstrating that community archiving is a community effort. The collection underwent conservation treatments in 2016, and this slide shows the plan before treatment was performed. And selections were featured in an OJA exhibition titled Benjamin Brown Architect and a companion short film titled Building History, which can be viewed on our YouTube channel. Next slide. Brown was born in Grodno, Lithuania in 1888 to Meyer and Tema Brown. The family immigrated to Toronto around 1896 and first lived in St. John's Ward, Toronto's first Jewish settlement area. They then moved east to Seton Street in Cabbagetown. Brown briefly attended Jarvis Collegiate before going to work in a garment factory to support his family. His inclination for the visual arts eventually led him to the Ontario School of Art and Design, but recognizing the insecurity of an artist's income, he decided to pursue architecture instead. Next slide. He entered U of T in 1909 by passing his matriculations with tutoring help from his friends. He completed his degree at the School of Practical Science in 1913. His choice of profession was a challenge to long-standing exclusionary practices that had historically barred Jews from entering the building trades. He was the only Jewish student in the architectural department for his entire 4 years. Upon graduation, Brown briefly went to New York, then returned to Toronto and opened up a private practice with fellow graduate Robert Stanley McConnell. Almost immediately, Brown began earning commissions from a network of Jewish businessmen who required new buildings for their businesses, the residences, and the organizations that they were establishing to serve the growing community. From their client list during this period, it is evident that Brown's Jewish communal connections secured most of these early commissions. For example, Ben Hillman, pictured here on the top right, would later become part owner of the clothing company Schiffer Hillman and would commission Brown to design a landmark building on Spadina Avenue in the heart of the Jewish-dominated garment industry. Next slide, please. However, Brown's big break would come in 1919 when businessman and community leader Mendel Granatstein commissioned him to design his new 3-story home at 42 St. George Street in Toronto. Granatstein had arrived from Radom, Poland in 1887. In 1895, he founded a rag sorting business. Rags brought to his warehouse by pickers were sorted, baled, and taken to the mills where they were turned into usable cloth. By the early 20th century, the Granatsteins had become one of the most prominent Jewish families in Toronto. Brown designed this home as a 6-bedroom mansion with a sunroom, a study, and a large living and dining room. It also contained a unique feature, a retractable roof over an enclosed porch adjacent to the kitchen to be used as a sukkah on the harvest holiday of Sukkot. Mr. Granatstein was also a founding member and longtime president of Beth Jacob Congregation, the synagogue that Brown was ultimately commissioned to build shortly after he completed Granatstein's home. Next slide, please. The early 1920s was a busy time for synagogue construction in Toronto. Many of the existing congregations were in need of new buildings for their growing membership. The community was also on the move, vacating the cramped quarters of St. John's Ward for Kensington Market and its surrounding neighborhood. Beth Jacob Congregation, founded in 1897, existed in 3 different locations in St. John's Ward before it purchased land at 23 Henry Street in 1919 on the edge of Kensington. Known as the Henry Street Shul, the new purpose-built synagogue was dedicated in August 1922. A crowd of 1,000 people attended the ceremonies, with many left outside, unable to get in. Beth Jacob could accommodate 800 worshipers, 500 in the men's section and 300 in the women's balcony, in keeping with Orthodox tradition. The congregation thrived on Henry Street for 40 years, until 1966, when it followed the northward Jewish migration to a new location in North York. The synagogue's intricately carved Aaron Kadesh and Bima, also designed by Brown, were removed and reinstalled in the congregation's new home in Bathurst Manor. The building on Henry Street was sold and converted into the Holy Trinity Russian Orthodox Church, which it remains as today. Benjamin Brown considered Beth Jacob Synagogue to be his crowning achievement. It was the first synagogue in Toronto to be designed by a Jewish architect. It was featured in the Toronto Daily Star during the proposal stage, as seen on this slide, and later at its opening ceremonies when the paper reported that the golden ceremonial key for the front door had been auctioned for $300 to Mr. Mendel Granitstein. That a synagogue of this magnitude and grandeur was entrusted to such a young and relatively inexperienced architect speaks to Brown's talent and reputation at the time, and signified the Jewish community's increased confidence in its new generation of emerging professionals. Next slide, please. By the mid-1920s, Brown had split with McConnell and entered his most active period with many prestigious and large-scale projects, including industrial, communal, commercial, and residential buildings. There were hundreds of Jewish-owned garment businesses making, selling, and distributing coats, dresses, blouses, hats, and shoes in the neighborhood around Spadina Avenue and Adelaide and Richmond streets, where the spoken language was predominantly Yiddish. The industry included both larger firms and smaller subcontractors, where the economic gap between employer and employee was often minimal. Jewish immigrants dominated Toronto's garment trades as workers, union leaders, and manufacturers. Brown was selected to build a number of large factory lofts that could accommodate both workrooms and showrooms. By 1930, when the economy slowed and new construction was halted, Brown's trifecta of graceful loft buildings, the Commodore, the Tower, and the Balfour, were complete. For all three, rather than a flat roofline, Brown designed a two-story tower, a clever and practical solution to hide the building's rooftop water towers. Additionally, all three used Brown's signature yellow brick with contrasting limestone embellishments on the first floor. The tower building was commissioned by Samuel Poslins, who owned Superior Cloak. Poslins was a lifelong philanthropist and community leader, and was involved in the Tailor Project, which brought over displaced persons to Canada as tailors after the Second World War. Opposite the Tower building and forming a gateway to the garment district was the Balfour building, arguably one of Brown's most significant commissions, and a Toronto landmark and designated heritage building. The Balfour was commissioned by Schiffer Hillman Clothing, Ben Hillman, who we saw earlier, and was occupied by many Jewish-owned garment businesses. The floor plans in Brown's collection reveal that large open spaces were incorporated into the design so that rows of sewing machines could be set up and large swaths of fabric unrolled and cut. With the Balfour, Brown added a number of distinguishing exterior flourishes to the grid-like plan, such as a cubist fan pattern embellishing the rooftop. These exterior decorative elements, along with the sophisticated interior of the building, make the Balfour one of the finest examples of Art Deco architecture in Toronto. Next slide, please. Other commissions in the garment district included buildings like the one shown here, the new textile building at 205 Richmond Street. An impressive 7-story commercial building completed in 1924, it was commissioned by Louis and Moses Gelber. Louis and Moses Gelber were born in Berjani, Galicia, and immigrated to Toronto in 1894. After operating a clothing store for 25 years, they entered the woolen industry. Both brothers were involved with various Jewish charities throughout their lives. A biography of Moses Gelber stated that, quote, Judaism to him was one indivisible whole, and his life's work and achievement was itself an affirmation of this concept of the essential oneness of Jewish purpose. Another connection for Brown came through the wife of Louis Gelber, Sarah Morris, who was sister to Dorothy Morris, the wife of optical lens manufacturer Percy Hermet. Percy Hermet was born in Russia in 1882 and immigrated to Canada at age 15, first working as a traveling salesman and later studying optics. He went on to establish the Imperial Optical Company and eventually became the largest manufacturer and seller of optical instruments in Canada. During the First World War, Herman expanded his business by making optical military instruments and by filling the void left in the market when German lens imports were banned. Brown knew that Percy Herman was planning on building a new tower to house his company, so he asked the Gelbers to recommend him. The 14-story Hermit building, located at 21 Dundas Square, was completed in 1929. Brown's early use of reinforced concrete construction to accommodate the heavy optical equipment was an innovative engineering strategy at the time. Next slide, please. This group of men were also responsible for establishing a new building to house the Toronto Hebrew Free School, first located on Simcoe Street. At the time, Moses Gelber was president of the building committee. The Brunswick Talmud Torah opened in 1925 and cost a scant $153,000 to build. The school contained 15 classrooms, a hall for 1,300 people, gymnasium, showers, tiled swimming pool, chapel, library, kitchens, dining room, and a concert stage. Brown was able to keep his costs low on builds like these because he acted as architect, designer, and contractor on all his jobs. He bought the materials and supervised the trades, including stonemasons, bricklayers, carpenters, electricians, glaziers, and plumbers. Next slide, please. Another community commission came to Brown early in his career. Originally named the Cosmopolitan Club, the Primrose Club was an elite Jewish men's club founded in 1909. At a time when many of the social clubs in Toronto barred Jewish membership, the Primrose Club provided a place for relaxed fraternizing among members of the community. It was also a society club where members could meet for dinner or host events such as weddings and parties. In the context of Brown's career, the Primrose Club was important. It was likely here that businessmen like Moses Gelber, Percy Hermit, and Samuel Poslins discussed their projects. In 1959, the building was expropriated by the University of Toronto to form its faculty club, and 50 years later, in 2009, the card room was renamed the Primrose Room to honor the first occupants of the building. Although Benjamin Brown only designed a handful of places for Jewish worship, education, and leisure, these buildings played an important role for the largely working-class Jewish population who utilized the spaces. They provided for social, educational, and cultural opportunities for Toronto's Jewish community to remain connected to their inherited culture and traditions. Next slide, please. By 1934, the economic slump of the Great Depression disrupted Brown's career trajectory. Commissions still came, but they were smaller and mostly alterations or minor additions. An alteration to a rooming house around 1935 is a telling marker of the period. Similarly, Brown was commissioned to design several independent gas stations and public garages to accommodate the growing car culture. Fewer clients were requesting the large statement buildings that had defined his early career. The onset of the Second World War seemingly halted his work altogether, and by the late 1940s and early 1950s, Brown was designing less and less. He officially retired in 1955 and died in 1974. Through our research, we have discovered that Brown designed or significantly altered no fewer than 170 buildings over the course of his career. In an oral history conducted by Cyril Troster and Susan Cohen in 1972, Brown remarked that out of those commissions, he only had a handful of non-Jewish clients his entire career, and often didn't bother to submit for most jobs because he knew he wouldn't get them. However, it would be a mistake to categorize Brown as being the beneficiary of an elitist network. That would be a misreading of his incredible talent as an architect and his artistic and design sensibilities. After all, in describing Brown's buildings, the late architect Jack Diamond stated that Brown exercised exquisite judgment on where to place emphasis. It would also obscure the fact that Brown's career had grown out of a discriminatory atmosphere where certain professions, educational opportunities, and services were not easily available to members of the Jewish community. These same professional and social limitations prompted those established community members who had limited spheres of influence themselves to develop and support early communal infrastructure, social services, educational, religious, and cultural organizations that would become so imperative during the Depression and following the Second World War, when Holocaust survivors began arriving in Toronto. Therefore, the collection of Brown's drawings not only illustrate his building, but also what was happening in the community, in industries like the garment trade, and in the services that were being built to sustain Jewish life. While Brown's story isn't well known, his buildings are hard to miss. Drawing a line between the two proves the power of archives to expand the narrative. Following our exhibition on Brown in 2016, Dave LeBlanc, architectural writer for the Globe and Mail, remarked that with this exhibit, Benjamin Brown takes his rightful place alongside Edward J. Lennox, John M. Lyle, Frank Darling, John Pearson, and other Toronto city builders of the first half of the 20th century. Next slide, please. So much of the community's history is worthy of this kind of exploration and celebration. There is no shortage of amazing stories to discover within the collections at the Ontario Jewish Archives, and you are invited to do so in person or through our website at ontariojewisharchives.org. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. That was wonderful. So next up, we have Janice Rosen, who has been the Archives Director since 1989 of the Alex Dworkin Canadian Jewish Archives, formerly known as the Canadian Jewish Congress National Archives. She is the co-creator of the Canadian Jewish Heritage Network, a database-driven website showcasing the holdings of several partner archives and museums. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the Kanyen'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the stewards of the unceded land now called Montreal, upon which this archives is located. The work of an archivist involves collecting historical records, preserving and organizing them, and making them available. And the object I'm going to be talking about is, for me, a symbol of the process of collecting archives. Next slide, please. But first, a few words about the CJ Archives and what we collect. As you can read here, we're located at 4810 Jean Talon West in Montreal, which is around 2 kilometers north of the Jewish Public Library. And the Alex Dworkin Canadian Jewish Archives, which was previously known as the Canadian Jewish Congress Archives, was established by CJC in 1934. We moved to our present location in 2018. Our general mandate is to collect and preserve documentation of the Jewish presence in Quebec and Canada. And the greatest part of our holdings date from the 20th century. The records of the Canadian Jewish Congress and the Jewish Immigrant Aid Services are among our most used assets. But almost all of aspects of the concerns of the Jewish community of Canada are reflected in our various collections. Notable among them, immigration and integration into Quebec society and Canadian society, community organization, Zionism, human rights issues and discrimination, and also literature, education, and family history records. Our total amount of archival material exceeds 1,500 linear meters, which means the equivalent of over 4,500 banker-sized boxes. And we assist an average of 1,000 researchers a year, both remotely and on our premises. Next slide, please. So here is our object. And you can get an idea of the size from the model's hands. The object that inspired this presentation is associated with a collection called the Joseph and Wolf Family Collection. And the woman showed on the right of this slide is Annette Wolf, the family historian. Every family has a family historian, don't they? Beginning in 1992 and continuing until 2008, this collection was donated in 18 increments, mostly from Annette, but also from 3 other Wolf sisters. It ultimately grew to occupy 18 banker-sized document boxes, plus a box of photographs and one of audio cassette tapes. And the object on the left, was acquired in 2001, along with what the accession record notes as a photograph of Clarence de Sola in riding costume taken in 1901, and a photocopy of a letter written in 1843 to a woman from the David family in Trois-Rivières. Now, I remember spending a good part of the afternoon in 2001 at Annette Wolf's apartment with the hope of acquiring some particular treasures she had hinted at donating in future. However, on that day, all she was willing to part with was those 2 pieces of paper. As I was leaving, I asked her about the interesting lion-headed sculpture that was propping up her office door, and Annette said, "Oh, that old thing. You can take it if you want." Well, feeling rather frustrated about coming back to the archives with so little, I happily accepted it, even though we don't usually collect 3-dimensional objects at the archives. But as it happens, this object held open the door to the acquisition of a significant and extensive corpus of materials about Quebec Jewish history. Next slide, please. Now, as many of you may have figured out, but perhaps some of you have not, that lion-headed object is an address embossing device. It stamps out the words 113 Grand Allée, Quebec. Constructed in 1882 for Abraham Joseph's son Montefiore, 113 Grand Allée, now numbered 675 Grand Allée East, is in the center of the block of houses that you see in this photo. And if you go to Quebec City and you go to the Old City, which you certainly will if you go to Quebec City, this is the street you will take to enter into the upper part of the Old City, so you'll surely pass by. Next slide, please. Now, the connection of this address to Annette Wolf is as follows. And this chart is probably too small for you to read, but I put some yellow highlighting on the key points, and those are the ones I'm going to focus on. Abraham Joseph had 13 children. You'll see a picture of them later. And his second son, Montefiore, who married Annette Pinto, who's in the photo on top there, had 5 children, including Irene Joseph, who was born in 1885. She's also pictured here. Irene was a published writer and an active community worker. And in 1909, she married Martin Wolfe, an engineer recently arrived from England. His interest in history had led him to become a founding member of the Canadian Jewish Congress Archives Committee, incidentally, to which he donated many important historical papers, notably about Quebec's first synagogue, the Spanish and Portuguese. The Wolfes had 6 daughters, although one of them died while quite young. You can see Annette with glasses in the bottom right of the photo of the 5 of the sisters. And Annette was very familiar with her grandfather's house on Grand Allée, where Irene had grown up. Next slide, please. But why were the Josephs important? Their story starts with Henry Joseph, who was a nephew of Aaron Hart, the earliest documented Jewish settler in Quebec, who had arrived with the British in the 1760s. The earliest Quebec Jewish families settled in Montreal, Trois-Rivières, Berthier, and Quebec City. And if you can see that map there, it means that they were all along the St. Lawrence River. Next slide, please. When Henry Joseph's son Abraham was born in Berthier in 1815, the Jewish community in Quebec was still very, very small. So we probably should not be surprised to learn that his circumcision as a baby, something that normally takes place 8 days after a boy's birth, was deferred to several months later. This original certificate, which is preserved at the CJ Archives, reads, "On the 8th day of July, 1816, I performed the covenant of circumcision on Abraham, the son of Henry and Rachel Joseph, born in Berthier in the province of Lower Canada, on the 14th of November, 1815. So it's likely, I think, that no qualified Jewish mohel or circumciser was available in November, and the family had to wait the arrival of Dr. Joel Hart from New York State the following summer. Next slide, please. Now, once he grew up, Abraham Joseph, who lived until 1886 and moved to Quebec City for most of his life, became an important member of Lower Canadian society. Besides carrying on his father Henry's successful trading business, Abraham served as president of the Quebec and Dominion Board of Trade, a director of the Banque Nationale, and as president of the Stadacona Bank. He was a Grand Master of the Grand Masonic Lodge of Quebec, and he was Vice Consul of Belgium in Quebec City. Next slide, please. And here's the picture of Abraham with his wife, Sophie, and several of his 13 children, which I promised you earlier. But before Abraham was married, he began keeping a voluminous and detailed diary, which provides a wealth of detail about daily life in the early and mid-1800s. And this is something for which he is particularly remembered. Next slide, please. This diary became an important focus of Annette Wolfe's mission as historian of the Joseph family. Over many years, she painstakingly rendered Abraham's handwriting into a massive typed transcript, and then ordered the text into chapters, which she hoped to have published as a book. Unfortunately, this never came to pass, but thanks to her eventual decision to donate them to the archives, we do have 2 large boxes of diary transcriptions available for consultation. And so here's a quote from one of the pages, which I just really pretty much grabbed at random, and which provides a glimpse of Quebec society at the time. At the beginning of the second paragraph, we read, Monday, 24th of June, 44, and that means 1844. As for that 24th of June date, do those of you from Quebec recognize anything about this day of the year? Well, here we go. The morning being fine, great preparations were commenced at an early hour of the day, being the anniversary of St. John the Baptist, titular saint of Canada. All the streets were decorated with trees, flags, and banners. The St. John Baptiste Society, a very numerous body, marched to the French Cathedral soon after 8 o'clock, and then goes on to describe more about the scene. But skipping to the last paragraph, he later goes on to note, Miss O'Donovan goes home to Ireland in a few days. Obliged to go, she said, and she has done all in her power, but no one will have her. If she could get married, she would not go, and so on. Such were the young lady's expressions to me, and Miss Zouch helped the matter by asking me afterwards why I did not prevent Miss OD from leaving Quebec. My reply was, because I was not an Irishman. Now, I think we can infer from this last line that Abraham's Jewish conscience was coming into play here. Next slide, please. Following in the family tradition, Abraham's daughter Fanny, who you see on the left, kept a diary as well. And this document from the 1880s can also be studied in the Joseph family collection. An earlier series in the Joseph family papers contains a file of fascinating handwritten family newsletters called the Blue Book. They were written by Abraham's brothers and sisters in Montreal from 1839 to 1841. There are 15 issues of the Blue Book in the collection. And when one deciphers the script, one can read about how these young people expressed their Judaism while living in the midst of fashionable mainstream society in Montreal. One of my favorite issues has a section in which the author chastises a young Jewish woman for attending a ball on a Friday night instead of respecting the Sabbath. Another family newsletter in the collection, which is called The Splendid Shilling, complains in 1840 of ladies who boast of being frightened if she hears the report of a pistol. I did a YouTube video about these publications years ago, to which I can send you a link if you're interested. Moving forward in time, documentation about Irene's work in women's organizations from the early 1900s have already been the subject of study by graduate students interested in gender and society. Other aspects of the Joseph Wolfe family collection which are of interest to scholars are the letters exchanged between members of the family through the years, such as in the post-1900 period, those from Martin Wolfe to his then fiancée Irene during the Boer War. And then there's letters between Martin Wolfe and Alfred Bader, an Austrian Jewish war refugee who had been interned as an enemy alien in southern Quebec in 1939. And we have letters between Annette and her sisters beginning in the 1920s and continuing while Annette was in England doing mysterious war work during World War II. The collection also includes over 13 hours of oral history recollections by Annette Wolfe recorded in 1999 by Aaron Harris. These tapes have been digitized and were indexed in detail during the pandemic as part of a remote work project for student interns. And my concluding slide, please. So, as you can see, that lion-headed doorstop opened the door to a donation of immensely broad scope and historical interest. I hope that these tidbits from the collection will open some doors for your own research as well. To learn more, you can start by looking up your subject of interest on the cjhn.ca website, which is shared by the Alex Dworkin Canadian Jewish Archives and 6 other partners, including the Jewish Public Library, the Shahar Shamayim Museum and Archives, the Ottawa Jewish Archives, and also the Montreal Holocaust Museum. If you don't find all that you need there, please contact us. The email address and phone number can be seen on the screen here. And thus concludes my object lesson. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. That was really wonderful. We have up next Hannah Sorozakhan, who is the archivist at the Congregation Shar HaShamayim here in Montreal, Quebec, where she has worked since 2021. Hannah holds a bachelor's degree in Jewish Studies and English Literature from McGill University and a master's in Information with a focus in archives and book history from the University of Toronto. She's an executive member for the Canada Regional Board of the Association for Jewish Libraries and serves on the AJL Jewish Fiction Award Committee. Welcome, Hannah.
Hey, yeah, thank you for the introduction. My name is Hannah, and I am the archivist at Congregation Shar HaShamayim in the municipality of Westmount on the island of Montreal. And the Shar is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst the Kanakehaga people. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. Next slide, please. Right, so we will begin first with a brief history of the Shar, which will provide context for our archival collection. The Shar is Canada's second oldest synagogue. It was originally founded as the English, German, and Polish congregation in 1846 as a breakaway congregation from Montreal Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. The Shar has had a long and illustrious history over its more than 175 years, and has had many congregants who are prominent members of the Jewish community or notable in Canada in general. Amongst the most famous names among the membership have included the singer-songwriter and poet Leonard Cohen, whose final album, You Want It Darker, featured the synagogue's cantor and choir. Throughout the years, the synagogue has hosted heads of state, local politicians, including both Pierre and Justin Trudeau, Israeli dignitaries, great leaders of the Jewish world, and so on. For instance, it was the Shar HaShamayim that saw after the itinerary of Rav Kook, who was one of the fathers of religious Zionism and the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of British Mandatory Palestine when he visited Montreal around 1923-1924. Elsewhere, the synagogue has made numerous contributions to Montreal beyond the Jewish community. For instance, under the leadership of Rabbi Wilfred Shushat, whom I'll speak a bit more about later, the synagogue spearheaded the design of the Pavilion of Judaism at Montreal's Expo 67. Across its history, the Shar has lived in 3 different buildings, and its current building in Westmount was completed 100 years ago in 1922. This past year, we marked the centennial with a beautiful rededication ceremony, 100 years to the day the sanctuary was initially dedicated. Now, over the course of the 20th century, the Shar was led by 2 longtime rabbis, Rabbi Herman Abramowitz from 1902 to 1947, followed by Rabbi Wilfred Shushat from 1947 to 1993, then emeritus until his passing in 2018. And today, the Shar HaShamayim, like any other synagogue, is going through a major time of transition due to the impact of the pandemic. And it was out of this moment of transition that the Shar's archive began to emerge. Next slide, please. At the top of your screen, you will see pictures of the interior and exterior of the synagogue building as it looks today. And at the bottom are 2 pictures of the interior exterior as it looked around the time of its construction in the 1920s. Next slide, please. Though the Shar's previous archival holdings were transferred to Canadian Jewish Archives, a project to establish our own archive on site began in January 2021 while Montreal was deep in its second COVID lockdown. The past president of the synagogue, Claire Berger, who I'm pleased to join us on the call today, took it upon herself to clean out the office of Rabbi Wilfred Shushat. And in the process of this, she noticed a filing cabinet sitting in synagogue storage and asked for it to be brought out. When opened, the contents were revealed to be Rabbi Shushat's papers documenting nearly all of his activities within the synagogue from the time of his hiring as assistant rabbi in 1946 until his official retirement in the early 1990s. It was around this time when we began sorting through the cabinets which I joined the archive project. And indeed, it was not just Rabbi Shushat's papers which we found, but buried at the back of one was a thick envelope. When I opened it, it was filled with the handwritten sermons and some correspondence of Rabbi Dr. Herman Abramowitz. Altogether, these filing cabinets represented a period of about 100 years of synagogue history. And this has merely been the tip of the iceberg as we continue to discover more documents, records, photographs, and materials throughout our building. As it stands, we have over 30 boxes, though that number will likely increase, containing the papers of Rabbi Herman Abramowitz, Rabbi Shushat, past synagogue presidents, synagogue committees, the synagogue sisterhood, and so on. We also have numerous photo albums, loose photographs, scrapbooks, and a growing number of audiovisual materials, including tape and video recordings. The archives at this time are largely unprocessed, though we hope to continue to make materials available. Some of our previously cataloged papers are listed on the Canadian Jewish Heritage Network website. And aside from the archives, we have an extensive museum collection with more than 500 artifacts and items of Judaica. And while our archives are evolving and various, among our most exciting recent extractions was a time capsule placed in the building in 1967, and another time capsule, which we also recently extracted from the cornerstone of the original building laid over 100 years ago in 1921. With all that said, I'm very excited to share with you all today one fascinating item, which though in itself is interesting, I hope the story of its provenance and how we happened upon it too will act as an example of the excitement of the early stages of establishing our archive. Next slide, please. Now this photograph is one of my personal favorites in our collection as it was the first item I found which gave me the sense of the importance of the project. Pictured here is the Solomon Schechter, to the left, and sitting to his next to him is Rabbi Abramowitz posing for a novelty picture in Atlantic City in 1906. The inscription reads, "Thought you might desire to possess this photo of Dr. S. Schechter. signed January 4th, 1906 by Rabbi Herman Abramowitz. Solomon Schechter was, aside from many Jewish day schools throughout North America bearing his name, he was absolutely peerless in the Jewish world and a scholar of the highest stature. Born in Moldavia, which is present-day Romania, he would later make his way to Western Europe, studying at the University of Vienna, later receiving rabbinic ordination. He would then come to England, where he would lecture for many years in rabbinics and Hebrew at Cambridge University and at the University College London. Among his many notable accomplishments include the discovery of the famed Cairo Geniza, which in turn made him famous. In 1902, Schechter came to America, where he took up a position at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, the institution which, to this day, provides rabbinic ordination to rabbis in the conservative movement. In that same year, 1902, Rabbi Herman Abramowitz was completing his own studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary, receiving his rabbinic ordination in June of 1902, and thus was among the very first cohort of Schechter's students. Meanwhile, back on the Canadian side of the border in Montreal, the Shar HaShamayim was struggling to find decent rabbinic leadership throughout the last decade of the 19th century. They'd had a string of rabbis who had stuck around for various reasons only for short terms. In need of a rabbi that year, 1902, for at least the high holiday services, they reached out to the Jewish Theological Seminary, and without hesitation, Solomon Schechter recommended his bright student, Rabbi Abramowitz, who then was a mere 22 years old. Though the congregation had initially wished for a more mature and older rabbi, he wowed the lot of them. By November of that year, Rabbi Abramowitz was hired. I believe the synagogue later held a banquet in 1903-1904 in Solomon Schechter's honor. Next slide, please. Rabbi Abramowitz's career with the Shar and his service to Canada's Jewish community was long and illustrious. In 1913, he served as expert witness in a court case known as the Plamondon Affair, in which a Quebec notary and journalist leveled a blood libel accusation against Quebec Jews. Abramowitz testified to the falsity of this anti-Semitic claim as an expert witness on the Talmud. During World War I, he was the first person to serve as a Jewish chaplain to Jewish servicemen from Canada. And in World War II, he assumed the responsibility for appointing all Jewish chaplains to Canadian servicemen. Within the community, he reestablished friendly relationships with the Spanish and Portuguese, which had been frosty at best since the Shar had split off in the mid-19th century. He believed strongly in Jewish communal unity, an idea also strongly upheld by his mentor, Solomon Schechter. Next slide, please. And we'll return now to that postcard. Well, in my first month of sorting through the files of Rabbi Shushat, that postcard photograph fell out of a letter, which you'll see pictured here, and that I was looking at had been sent to Rabbi Shushat in 1968. The letter was sent by Harvey Golden. Harvey Golden's wife was a woman named Riva, whose maiden name was Cohen. And indeed, her father was a man named Abraham Zebulun Cohen. As per the letter, and this was the person to whom Rabbi Abramowitz sent the postcard initially. Why is this interesting? Abraham Cohen was the brother of Lion Cohen and the son of Lazarus Cohen, both of whom are among the synagogue's longest serving presidents and leaders throughout the whole of the Jewish community in their day. Lion Cohen, for instance, whom we heard about in part 1 of Archives Roadshow, oversaw the construction of the Shar's current building, was also a founder in Montreal of the United Talmud Torahs, the Jewish General Hospital, and along with his close friend, Samuel William Jacobs, also a synagogue member, and who served for many years as a member of parliament, together founded the first English Jewish paper in Canada, the Canadian Jewish Times, which they founded in the wake of misinformation being circulated in other presses in Canada following the Dreyfus Affair. However, today, we might know Lion and Lazarus Cohen better as the ancestors of Leonard Cohen. Lazarus Cohen and Lion Cohen were respectively the singer-songwriter's great-grandfather and grandfather, and Abraham Cohen was his great-uncle. Also, the year in which Rabbi Abramowitz was hired, 1902, was the same year in which the synagogue presidency passed from Lazarus Cohen to Lion Cohen, and thus from father to son. Why is this postcard photograph important then? Well, there are many reasons. First, the picture importantly elucidates the close relationship between Schechter and Abramowitz. Solomon Schechter was a major influence on Abramowitz's rabbinic and leadership perspectives, and Rabbi Abramowitz would carry these ideals forward with him to the Shar, importantly shaping the synagogue's traditions and practices, which carry forth in the synagogue to this day. And aside from the story which the photograph itself shows, the story of its journey is equally illuminating. In following its journey, we see it pass through the hands of some of the synagogue's most important and influential community builders, passing from Rabbi Abramowitz to the Cohen family, then to the hands of Rabbi Shushat. All in all, to me, this postcard is a wonderful example of just how much more there is to one object beyond its face value, and how when we put archival holdings in their context, just how much we can learn. In archives, the orders in which papers come to us can provide very important context to the papers with which they are arranged. Imagine for a second that the picture had not been found, the letter had solely been found alone. Or on the other hand, the letter, when opened, was simply the letter without the postcard. In either scenario, we would be losing some piece of important context. To close, I'll bring your attention to a particular line from this letter, which will never cease to amuse me. And it appears at the end where Harvey Golden writes to Rabbi Shushat, quote, "I thought you might be interested in having for the synagogue archives this interesting snap." Well, it just took over 50 years to get there. And next slide, please. Thank you very much for listening today. I will invite you to keep up with our ongoing work through our blog on the Shar Shemaim's website, and to read some coverage of our work in the news, including our aforementioned time capsules. And feel free to reach out to me via email or Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Last up today, we have Tegan. Tegan Goldsmith has an honors bachelor degree in history from Trent University and a postgrad degree from Fleming College in museum management and curation. Her main area of study over the years have been in the Holocaust. She has worked in a number of historical institutions such as the Whitchurch Stouffville Museum, the Bytown Museum, and the Diefenbunker Museum. Tegan started working at the Ottawa Jewish Archives in November of 2019. Welcome, Tegan.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay? Oh, Ellen, are you able to hear me?
I can hear you just fine. Yep.
Okay, perfect. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm on my phone today. So I'm hoping this goes well from my end. So good afternoon. My name is Tegan Goldsmith, like Ellen said, and I'm the archivist at the Ottawa Jewish Archives. So like everybody else, I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. And we would just like to acknowledge that Ottawa, the land on which the Ottawa Jewish Archives is situated, is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We know that acknowledging the land will not remove or atone for the atrocities that have taken place, yet it is our intention to honor the first peoples of this land as we move with humility in the direction of reconciliation, healing, and justice. Next slide, please. Perfect. Okay, so just a little bit about the Ottawa Jewish Archives before we get started. So the Archives is located in the Solway Jewish Community Center in Ottawa, which is actually where I'm sitting right now. This, however, hasn't always been our home. When the Archives was first established, we had a small room in Ottawa's first JCC, which was on Chapel Street. And if you look at the photo on the screen, that is the opening of the Chapel Street JCC back in the 60s. The Archives was established in 1969, and our mandate is to strive to maintain the collective memory of the Jewish community of Ottawa through its objectives to acquire, preserve, and make accessible its holdings, which document the history, growth, and development of the Jewish community within Ottawa and the National Capital Region. This is basically just a really winded way of saying that we collect items that pertain to Jewish Ottawa specifically, as well as the National Capital Region of Ottawa. Our collection helps to tell the story of community life starting in the 1890s all the way up until the present day. In 1998, the Jewish Federation of Ottawa took financial responsibility for the archives, and we have been a part of their team ever since. Next slide, please. So the item that I've chosen to showcase in our collection is the Lillian Freeman beret, which you can see on the screen here. So this burgundy colored beret features a yellow crown insignia on the front. And it's accompanied by a letter from Mr. Frank Potts, which I have pictured beside it as well, who was the executive secretary for the Royal Canadian Legion. So this beret in particular was bestowed to Lillian in 1939 by Mr. Potts himself. The beret arrived with a letter explaining that the style of beret was made specifically for Ottawa servicemen in honor of a visit from His Majesty the King of England. The letter also said that he wanted Lillian to have the beret because he didn't know, quote, of a more, he didn't know of a better and more preserved or more deserving soldier than Lillian. Lillian is a very, very well-known person in Ottawa's Jewish history. She comes from one of Ottawa's earliest families. However, her impact has reached far past just Jewish Ottawa in general, extending to the rest of the city, as well as to Canada as a whole, really. And I'll get into that in a little bit. This beret is really a symbol of her hard work and dedication, and to Tikkun Olam, pardon me, which is just leaving the world a better place than you found it. I really think she embodies this. Lillian is a very special kind of person. She was extremely kind, she was an extremely generous person, and she was just willing to drop whatever she was doing in order to help those around her. For me, she really embodies the essence of Ottawa's Jewish community, which is giving, kind, and exceptionally involved. Next slide. So I'll give you a little bit of a background on Lillian. She was the daughter of Moses and Pauline Bilski, who again are one of the earliest Ottawa Jewish settlers. She was the fifth of their 11 children, and her father Moses was one of the earliest Jewish settlers, and the family was just extremely giving and charitable. Newcomers to Ottawa could often find themselves in the Bilski home until they were able to find a place for themselves. Moses frequently helped people to find jobs, and Pauline was always there to help a fellow mother or child. All this to say, Lillian really grew up in a home where giving to others was just what you do. It was very much the norm. In 1903, at the age of 18, Lillian attended her very first Zionist convention in Montreal, which really set the stage for what would become a lifelong commitment to Zionism, philanthropy, and community involvement. In August of that same year, Lillian married Mr. Archibald Jacob Friedman, who many of us know as A.J. Freeman. He was a very well-known man in the community, owning Freeman's department store just downtown Ottawa, and anybody who was here, back in the 60s would certainly remember and talk very highly of Freeman's department store. So Lillian worked tirelessly during the First World War. She hosted Red Cross sewing circles in her home, which involved installing 30 sewing machines in her living room in her actual home. Women would come in weekly, they would make blankets and clothes to be sent overseas to those fighting abroad. In 1917, Lillian really became concerned with how servicemen would transition back into everyday life after 4 years of fighting in Europe. Her solution to this was to create the Great War Veterans Association, which today we now know is known as the Royal Canadian Legion. Pardon me. Once again, Lillian gave up space in her home for the cause, and a room in her home was actually used as the local headquarters. She even provided the furnishings for it. Next slide, please. There we go. So in September of 1918, the Spanish influenza had finally reached Ottawa, and once again, Lillian rose to the occasion. That year, the mayor called an emergency meeting of city officials, religious leaders, and influential community leaders, really to discuss how best it would be to fight the epidemic here in Ottawa. It was decided that an immediate organization was needed in order to handle the matter. And it was unanimously agreed that there was only one woman in the whole city who could get this done, and it was Lillian. She was called to City Hall late Friday night to discuss the details and due to it being Shabbat, she walked all the way to City Hall. When she walked in, it was nearly midnight, and she was asked by the mayor to coordinate the epidemic relief. She, of course, accepted, being Lillian. She was asked to organize the local relief efforts to really confront the influenza epidemic, which resulted in the organization of a centralized information book and continual release of progress reports to keep the public informed. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, quote, "For 5 weeks, she worked relentlessly with the medical officer of health, Mr. Dr. Robert Law. She organized a group of 1,500 volunteers who nursed the sick and provided them with food and clothing. By the time the outbreak had come under control, she had earned the love and respect of Ottawans from all walks of life," unquote. Next slide, please. Oh, I think you need to go back one. Oh, it looks like one of my slides wasn't included, but I'll just talk about this one quickly. So the war orphans was another subject and another project that she took. undertook. So in the summer of 1920, word had reached Canada's Jewish communities about the conditions of orphaned Ukrainian Jewish children, and really the conditions that they were living in. It was reported that some 137,000 children were living in villages without food or homes, and they were really in need of a lot of help. Lillian once again immediately took action as the national president of the Jewish War Orphans Committee of Canada, with Archie, her husband, as chairman of the executive committee. They invited Mrs. Arthur Meighen, the prime minister's wife, to be co-president of the committee. There we go, that's the slide. Lillian arranged a meeting with Frederick Charles Blair, who was an official with the Department of Immigration and Colonization, and she requested that 1,000 of these Jewish Ukrainian war orphans be allowed to enter into Canada. Her request was met with 200 orphans being granted entry. So with this granted entry, Lillian then began raising money to place these children into homes. In 1921, with $100,000 raised, she traveled to Belgium to transport 150 of the 200 granted orphans to Canada and to place them into homes. I should mention too that prior to her departure, her and Ida Ziegler personally inspected each home individually to make sure that the homes these children were ending up in were in good condition and they would be treated very well. In the end, when Lillian returned home, she had 146 children with her, all of whom were placed in homes across Canada. She and her husband, AJ, actually ended up adopting one of the children themselves. And Lillian continued to check on these children throughout her lifetime to make sure that they were happy, they were healthy, and really earned herself the name as Mama Freeman by many of these children. And I will note too that a number of them ended up here in Ottawa, of course, and their descendants are still here too. Okay, next slide, please. The Poppy campaign's the next one. Perfect. So talking about Lillian really wouldn't be complete without discussing her most well-known venture, which is the Poppy campaign. And this is one that's affected all of us that I know many of you will be quite familiar with. In 1921, Anna Guerin visited Canada. And for anyone who may not know, Guerin was the director of charity, which sold poppy boutonnieres to help raise money in France after the war. Anna had previously been invited to the United States, where she expressed her idea of having an inter-allied countries adopt the poppy as the national symbol of remembering veterans. She then traveled to Canada after her United States meeting, where she met with Lillian and explained the importance of the poppy. Lillian immediately saw potential in this, and she made it her mission to really incorporate this idea into Canadian remembrance. She campaigned for the poppy to be recognized as Canada's national symbol of remembrance, and in 1921, that same year, she really began making the poppy so that they could be shared on what would become Canada's very first Poppy Day. It is rumored that the very first poppies were made in her home, which, based on her ability to share her space with her many organizations, really doesn't surprise me in the least. The very first Poppy Day was on November 11th, 1921. And last year, when we had Remembrance Day, was actually celebrating the 100th anniversary of the very first Poppy Day. As you can see on the screen on the right-hand side, that is one of the very first poppies that would have been sold. So Lillian would go on to lead Canada's Poppy Day until her death in 1940. And as we all know, this tradition continues on today, as in November and into October, you can really find poppies just about anywhere for Remembrance Day. Next slide, please. Perfect. Lillian received this beret, the one that I've been talking about, from Frank Ponce in 1939, which was 1 year before her death. At the time, she was in a hospital bed. The letter even acknowledges her illness and wishes her good health and a return to her post soon. Unfortunately, this would not end up happening. Even in her final months, Lillian continued to work from her bed, as you can see from the photo, answering letters and sending others in her place to help others when she could. She passed away on November 2nd, 1940. Upon her death, the whole of the community showed up to mourn Canada's loss. The streets were lined with mourners and included a number of Canadian politicians and prime ministers. Her coffin, which you can see on the left-hand side, was half covered in red poppies when they took her out of the very first synagogue. She was only 55 years old when she passed. Next slide, please. So there are many, many other things that I could say about Lillian and the work that she did. But these few instances that I've mentioned, I think really highlight enough about Lillian to really tell you what kind of person she was. So this beret, which we have in the collection, was given to her by Frank Potts with the understanding that she received it because she deserved it. It isn't just a hat that Lillian owned. It was really a symbol of who she was as a person. It represents all the good that she did in the world, all the lives she affected through her generosity and kindness. These berets were given to servicemen in honor of a visit from the king. And by giving her this beret as well, she was honored among the ranks of male soldiers who fought during the First World War. And for me, this is extremely telling of a woman in the 1930s to have received it. I think it would have been quite an honor and she would have been very, very proud. I think this item really speaks to my collection as a whole for a number of reasons. First, Lillian was a pivotal person in this community. There's really no denying that. Her impact reaches far past our initial Jewish community, into Ottawa, into Canada, and even across seas with the Ukrainian war orphans. You know, she was a part of the Bilski family who made people feel welcome and supported when they arrived here in Ottawa. And this really continued into her adult years as well. She didn't just stop to help Ottawa's Jewish community, she helped Canadians and those in other countries as well. She worked day and night to bring efforts to others, and even in her final months, she continued to work. The beret is really just a symbol of everything that Lillian was, and I'm really grateful that we're able to have this in our collection and talk about it. And just to comment on what Hannah said, it's all about context, right? This is just a hat. Otherwise, if we don't have the stories around it, the resources, the letter, for example, we really wouldn't know much else about the hat, except for maybe that it was given to Canadian soldiers or Ottawa Jewish soldiers. So I just think that it really speaks a lot to the collection, to Lillian, and to our community as a whole. Next slide. So thank you all for listening. These are some of the ways you can get a hold of the archives if you need to reference anything or are interested, as well as a link to our website, which has a bunch of our resources, and a link to the Canadian Jewish Heritage Network, like Janice mentioned.
Thank you, Tegan. Wow, this was an amazing series of presentations. I really enjoyed this. Before we dive into the question period, which we will not be recording, I just wanted to say a really big thank you to all of the presenters for your wonderful presentations today, and to all the attendees for your attention and the thoughtful questions that we've been seeing trickle in, which we'll be asking shortly. I'll just do a little conclusion before we end the recording for the people who will be watching this on YouTube later. We have one more event in the series coming up on December 11th, which you can register for on our Eventbrite. And if you've missed the first part of the series, it has been posted to YouTube, and this one will be joining it shortly. We'll be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered through Eventbrite that has the links to these videos, as well as a feedback form. We love getting community feedback, and by filling it out, it really helps us continue to improve our offerings. So thank you everyone for being here, and we look forward to seeing as many of you as possible on December 11th.